Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. Charles Beard. Group 7. Chris Martinez, Jocelyn Jones, Catherine Kaiser, and Vicente Villarreal. Chapter 1. Historical Interpretation of the United States. George Bancroft believed in divine guidance, and he really implied religion while he would talk about his opinions. Religion, race, and historical sources were three of the schools that helped develop the interpretation of the United States. Bancroft believed in divine power and guidance, which gives unity to the universe and order and connection to events. Teutonic ascribes the wonderful achievements of the English-speaking people to the peculiar political genius of the Germanic race. Teutonic helps find the institutional development of the Anglo-Saxon world in innate racial equalities. Teutonic people were originally endowed with singular political talents and aptitudes. These tribes invaded England and destroyed the last vestiges of older Roman and British cultures. The people the absence of hypothesis includes the theory of economic determinism. The historical sources that are shown assume that Pascal, the will, imagination, the disorders of the body, 1,000 concealed infirmities of the intelligence, is referred into the book to help people understand what people are trying to get their other people's perspective on. Economic connections in history have been ignored. Economic advantages were expected that could be beneficial. The economic interpretation, inspired by Professor Turner of University of Wisconsin, under the direction that the influence of material circumstances of American politics was clearly pointed out. In economic advantages, on the book it says, suppose, on the other hand, that substantially all of the merchants, money leaders, security holders, manufacturers, shippers, capitalists, and financiers, and their professional associates are to be found on one side in support of the Constitution. This helps get all of the school's main point across. Chapter 2. A Survey of Economic Interest in 1787. The Distribution of Property. Real property ownership is gathered and can only be approximate. The size, value, and ownership of holdings and their geographical distribution should be discovered. The absence of a general census, the preparation in an economic survey would be entailed to enormous labor, the geographic distribution of money on hand and loaned to names of the holders. After federal government was established, the old debt was converted into funded debt. Disenfranchised groups, slaves, indentured servants, and working class outside of politics. The mass of men who could not qualify for voting under the property tests imposed by the state constitutions and laws, and women, disenfranchised and subjected to the discriminations of the common law. Sorry, excuse background noise. These groups weren't presented in the convention except under the theory that representation has no relation to voting. The extensiveness of the disenfranchisement has yet to be determined. Groups of real property holders, small farmers, slave-holding planters, and manorial lords. This is a homogeneous class of debtors. First group of small farmers consisted of mechanics, the poorer whites, and European immigrants, and of course this was a homogeneous class. They had peculiar social and political views. These people were in debt, and propositions were requiring the debtors to accept land instead of specie at a valuation fixed by a board of arbitration. Personal property interests, money loaned, state and continental securities, stocks of goods, manufacturing plants, and soldiers' scrip, and shipping. This embraced particularly money loaned and continental securities, stocks of goods, manufacturing plants, and shipping. Chapter 3. The Movement for the Constitution. Articles of Confederation. The central government had no power to regulate commerce or taxes directly. The national government consisted of a legislature, of one house in which the states had an equal voting power. The absence of these powers made all branches of the government to render helpless. Money couldn't be secured to pay the holders of public securities, either interest or principal. Economical groups questioned the national government. People wanted to change the government to improve opportunities for specific groups in the economy. Trading and manufacturing companies suspend their voyages and manufactures till they see how far their commerce will be protected and promoted by a national system of commercial regulations. According to the book, The Movement for a Constitution, the lawful usher locks up or buries his specie until he sees whether the new frame of government will deliver him from the curse or fear of paper money and the tender laws. Then, several examples that show men in the connection of economic interest to secure their property from the government are from the book, and there's multiple examples, and they say, an inquiry into the first signs of discontent with the prevailing system, their geographic distribution, and their economic sources. Next, an examination of the several attempts in the Congress under the Articles of Confederation to secure the power to regulate commerce and establish a revenue for discharging the debt. Next, a description of the economic interests of all members who were most active in these attempts. Then a description of the economic forces in the communities whose representatives in Congress were zealous in securing a revision of the Articles.
Chapter 4, Property Safeguards in the Election of Delegates. So the Congress provides that delegates should be appointed by the states. The choice of delegates to the convention was afforded by the property qualifications generally placed on voters and members of the legislatures by the state constitutions and laws taken place in 1787. Selection was made by the legislature, and both houses were able to participate. The suffrage upon all males possessing a freehold estate of the annual income of £3. Overall, Chapter 4 consists of each state and defining the purpose in the Constitution. Different states all had their different interpretations in different areas that they had that was able to make a point in the Constitution. For example, New York senators were required to be freeholders and also chosen to be them by the freeholders. Chapter 5, The Economic Interest of the Members of Convention. Purpose is the inquiry whether the members of the convention, which is what drafted the Constitution, represented by their own property affiliations, any or all of these groups. The main point was to consider if they represent distinct groups whose economic interests they understood and felt in concrete form, their own experience with identical property rights, or were they working under principles or political science. In this chapter, it told us a lot about money and power and how much people were able to put into the economic side of things if one has a lot of money. Through all of these mistakes, they were made by trying to build a new and improved government. After some time, they were able to succeed, which was through fundamental economic interests. And when I say they, I mean the men inside the government and who were in charge of the government. And Chapter 6, the Constitution as an economic document. The Constitution is revealed by a long and careful study of the correspondence of this period, such as newspapers and pamphlets. This correspondence is able to show the exact character of the evils which by the Constitution was intentions were for and to the remedy. The Federalist presents a short form of the economic interpretation of the Constitution by men who fit best. The economic system has two parts, one negative and one positive. A government endowed with certain positive powers, but so constructed as to break the force of the majority rule and prevent invasions of the property rights of minorities. And then restrictions on the state legislators, which had been so vigorous in the attacks on capital.
In Chapter 7, the political doctrines of the members of the convention. Some of the main points that are in this slide considered whether the members of the convention are matching their views to the political system. Political philosophers and leaders in politics in the 18th century were not under the need of observing the economic opposition featuring in law and constitution making. Their focus was mainly on the disfranchisement of the property list. This made it difficult for political writers to address themselves in matters of public policy. Throughout the chapter, majority of the chapter, I should say, was an overview of 41 political doctrine views of the members of the convention, and it included where they were from and what they contributed, what remarks they agreed and disagreed on, and political views and discussions of the structure within the Constitution. The authors of the Federalists generalized the political doctrines of the members of the convention with precision, in spite of the diversity of opinion which prevailed on many matters. In Chapter 8, the process of ratification, some of the main points in this chapter were that at the convention at Philadelphia, it finished the 17th day of September, 1787, where they finished its works and transmitted the new Constitution. The convention proposed that when 9 states have ratified the new Constitution, it should go into effect as between the states ratifying the same. Issues and oppositions regarding provisions and the extent of authority given to legislators were mentioned and discussed. Members of the convention showed 4 main reasons that led to the agreement and ratification. Permitted the disregard of the principle of unanimous approval by the states. Firmer foundation would be laid in the Constitution. The convention was to pay the public debt at par. Members learned from the repeated appeals to the state legislators for funds. Madison took up the cause and the Federalists to make a case for his side, referring to the analysis of the instructions of the delegates. On December 14th, 1787, the federal constitution was adopted by the legislature, and the vote count on the ratification was 187 to 168, leaving the Federalists in favor. In Chapter 9, the popular vote on the Constitution, some main points in this chapter were that the Constitution was viewed as an expression of the will of the whole people. A historical view of the matter requires an analysis of the people into its constituent elements. The Constitution was not submitted to popular ratification. The referendum was not unknown at the time, but it was not a fixed solution. Voters who took part in selecting delegates to the ratifying convention were divided into 4 elements. Those who were in favor of the Constitution, those who were just as consciously against it, those who were willing to leave the matter to the discretion of their elected representatives, and those who voted blindly. A considerably amount of adult white males were unable to participate in the election of delegates due to suffrage. Suffrage qualifications were left to state legislators. According to Dr. Jameson, he concluded that 3% of one out of 5 of the populations of those who were entitled to vote took part in the first election in 1780. Shays' rebellion and political excitement brought up votes by 5 to 6% in the spring election of '87. And New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia, in all these states, The conventions at the time of their elections were either opposed to the ratification of the Constitution or so closely divided that it was hard to tell which way the final vote would go.
In Chapter 10, titled The Economics of the Vote on the Constitution, we as the readers are given an insight on the economic side of things. The economic approach is one that must be considered if Hamilton wants to